Good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to the Fifth Estate this evening here at the wonderful Wheeler Centre. My name is Sally Warhaft, and got two wonderful guests tonight, primed to talk about our topic, the US midterms and beyond. Two people who have long-standing both deep interests in America and ties to America, coming from sort of slightly different places, I suppose, those interests. But I'm so delighted tonight that Dennis Altman, Emeritus Professor and Professorial Fellow in the Institute for Human Security at Trobe University, is with us. He's the author of, I think, is it 14 books now, Dennis? Yep. Including the acclaimed Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, which was published in 1972 and remains in print. He also is, of course, the author of Gore Vidal's America and 51st State. Dennis has been a visiting professor at Australian Studies at Harvard and the University of California, Santa Cruz, New York University and Chicago University. He was listed by the Bulletin as one of the 100 most influential Australians ever, and was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2008. Bob Carr, former Premier of New South Wales, former Senator in the federal government where he served as Minister for Foreign Affairs from March 2012 to September 2013. He is also the author of quite a few books, including My Reading Life, Thought Lines, Diary of a Foreign Minister, and very recently, Bob Carr, Run for Your Life, a fantastic memoir, and there'll be autographed copies for sale from Metropolis Bookshop at the end of this event, and all proceeds from this book go to children of the Syrian war. Is that right, Bob? So a terrific read. Please give Bob and Dennis a big welcome. I'm going to start by asking each of you to just talk about what the significance of these midterms is. Bob, you go first.
Whatever happens, Trump wins. This makes it gruesomely interesting. If he faces a Democrat-controlled House, which is likely, whatever happens in the Senate, He's got, as other presidents have had, a rallying cry and an excuse. He's a natural oppositionist. He exploits the politics of grievance. And that means for 2 years running up to 2020, he's able to say, I could have stopped the illegal immigrants except for the Democrats who control the Congress. I could have saved those jobs in American manufacturing and brought the jobs back, except I was blocked by those Democrats in Congress insisting on environmental regulation and all the rest. That would suit him. And we've seen that he's an especially effective communicator. The great presidents have had their own favourite mode of communication. I think these rallies are his. And I've watched mesmerised the broadcast of several of them, and we've got to be careful. As a political scientist like Dennis will quickly remind us of making analogies with fascism, but they do have extreme populist rhetoric that makes one think of fascist antecedents. There you are. I think whatever happens, Trump wins. The fact is, he could get less of a rebuff than Obama, Clinton and George W. Bush have had in comparable midterms, given that he owns the issues of immigration and trade, but especially immigration, given what's happening south of the border.
Well, maybe we should explain, in case people are a bit confused by this, there are two houses of Congress. When we drew up our Constitution, took the nomenclature from the US. The House of Representatives, where the Democrats could, as Bob suggests, possibly win a majority. I'm not going to predict, but there is a possibility. And the Senate, which is far more powerful than our Senate, senators are elected for 6 years and only a third of them are up for election this time. But most unfortunately for the Democrats, a number of the senators up for re-election come from states where Trump has a very strong following. So the Democrats could well win the House, extremely unlikely, I would think, to win the Senate. Having said that, I'm not sure I agree with, but I agree with you about the rallies. It seems to me that Trump actually likes campaigning more than he likes being president. And I agree, the rallies are very, very frightening. And watching the faces of the people at the rallies, which we can do on television, is very frightening. But I think if the Democrats get control of the House, what that means is they can use the power of Congress to investigate. They can start asking very hard questions of Trump and his cronies. And they could, for example, find ways of getting his tax records or his tax returns on the public record. So I'm not sure that Trump wins if the Democrats get control of the House, although, as I say, I'm not in the business of predicting, and I'm not at all sure that the Democrats will.
Bob, just to touch on this idea of Trump the winner no matter what, I've been thinking more about if he were to lose the House, particularly, it looks more likely. We've not yet seen Trump the loser of anything yet in his entire, from the time he announced his bid to run. And one of the things that frightens me almost as much as Trump winning is Trump losing, and what sort of a response he might have to that.
I think it would quicken the one of the strands in his psychology, which is a morose self-pity. And that'd be frightening for America, frightening for the world, if that intensifies, because it feeds his sense of grievance. His big gripe against the media, for example, the fake news media, the lying the failing New York Times. But if he's got a Democrat majority House pursuing his tax records and bumping alongside the Mueller investigation, developing some relationship with that inquiry, the Democrats would have to be careful not to trip up the special prosecutor's investigation. There are all sorts of opportunities and invitations for Trump to really take them on. And I think I see Trump as a genius without talent. By this paradox, I mean that he lacks the basic political talent that even mediocre presidents acquire, of speaking on great occasions in a way that unifies the nation. The fact that his first comment out of this tragedy in the synagogue had to involve him attacking the management of the synagogue for not using the armed guard. I mean, no other president would demean a White House commentary on a national tragedy by immediately picking up a partisan debating point. So he's talentless, but he's a genius because he's transformed his own party, he's transformed the Democrats, he's shifted American foreign policy radically, I'd argue. We might pick over that later. And he's got the capacity to rise to the challenge of a hostile House and demean and devalue its war against him. The side effect of this, and it's something we'll have to come to, I think, one side effect of this is that Washington gets trapped in a political deadlock that is going to absorb a lot of American energy. Just as well, politics is irrelevant to big areas of American creativity and the American economy, because Washington's going to become a very ugly place, a president at war with a Democrat majority House.
Yeah, I love your phrase, Bob, because it strikes me that we live in a country where our leaders have talent but no genius. Okay, thank you. That's pretty good because I riffed off Bob's line.
It's a life with
It
so
does
unkind,
strike
Bob.
me.
isn't
I
it?
mean, I'm going to try and give a more optimistic picture, although I'm afraid I basically agree with you. If the Democrats do better in this election, that is, if they actually win a decent majority in the House and manage to hold on to most of their seats in the Senate, this might give some courage or backbone to those Republicans who loathe Trump but have been unwilling to stand up to him out of sheer self-interest. I mean, I think I've given up looking for a moral spine in the American Republican Party. It's not there, or if it were there, it probably died with John McCain. But I think a Democrat victory could do what Bob's suggesting. It could also lead to some of the Republicans looking ahead, looking to their own careers, the senators who will come up for election 2 years from here, and possibly being more willing to stand up against him. That's an optimistic hope.
We tend to, I think, view the midterms from afar as a referendum on the presidency, but is that how it actually works at the polling booths, do you think, or is it more local?
Oh, I think it does, and that's how the media is interpreting it. I don't see other distracting issues. It's all wrapped up with the nature of the demagoguery that's the populism that's taken over American politics. The sheer radical force of what Trump represents. The first populist, not to capture a nomination, William Jennings Bryan, a radical, got nominated 3 times for president by the Democratic Party and helped to some extent radicalise it. Barry Goldwater might be seen as a populist who captured the Republican Party nomination in 1964. But this is the first time someone's got the presidency as a populist, at least since Andrew Jackson in 1828. This is a radical presidency. This is a president sitting in the White House at war with many American institutions. What he has said, standing up at one of those rallies and mocking his own generals. This is lingua franca that no other US president has toyed with. Never. He's stress testing so many features of the US Constitution, so many US institutions, and I think permanently degrading that Constitution, a very resilient Constitution written in the 1780s. These midterms can't be anything other than a verdict on him. There have been other radical presidencies. Franklin Roosevelt, with his improvised and bold response to the Great Depression, facing the people 2 years in. Obviously, those midterms are a verdict on him. You can think of others since. No, this is wholly about the Trump presidency.
Yes, except if you look at the states where Democrats could win the Senate, they include states where Trump is popular. I mean, I agree with you, Bob. Certainly the traditional way in which Americans voted for Congress, which didn't necessarily correlate with how they voted for the presidency, I think that's broken down, partly because the ideological gap between the parties has become so much wider and more obvious. But there are still states, North Dakota is a very good example, Indiana, quite a few of them, where the Democrats have a possibility of holding their Senate seat, despite the fact that the majority of that state, or the majority of people who bother to vote, are strongly for Trump.
Yeah, Ohio's another example where the Democratic senator is campaigning on what might have been referred to in the old days as lunch pail issues. He's defending workers' pensions. and he speaks with a lot of credibility on it. So he's running against Trump, but on an issue different from an issue not related to the Trump agenda.
But of course,
so that would be an exception.
And of course, where you're right is the Trump presidency will have a huge impact on who turns out to vote. And one of the things we forget is we are used to the idea of going to vote. Thank God we live in a country which has compulsory voting, a fair electoral system.
Preferential voting.
I've always thought that the Australian government, Bob, you missed a great opportunity. When you were Foreign Minister, you should have offered to the United States, in all goodwill, the services of the Australian Electoral Commission. Because, seriously, the way they run elections is so flawed that were it happening in a country they didn't like, they would be putting sanctions on that country for the way it conducts its elections.
Or their voter suppression practices,
exactly.
For example. Imagine an American Institute for the Spread of Democracy, and they have congressional funded bodies with names like that, looking at a country where state governments unabashedly implement an agenda to make it hard or impossible for black or poor or Hispanic voters to get to a polling place.
And a president also egging on and saying there's going to be police at the polling stations, so if you want to avoid a bit of law enforcement, probably best not to vote.
Yeah, he's made explicit this practice of voter suppression. So I've got a bold idea here that I just want to share with you, Dennis, and you, Sally, and with our audience. We can explore it at question time. I'm now not inclined to describe America. Certainly America can't be described as a liberal democracy. You couldn't describe it as a liberal democracy where the National Rifle Association, regardless of the view of 80% of voters, gets its way on background checks for gun purchase. Or where money counts so decisively in elections, where money, for example, has undermined action on climate change. I don't think America, and where, as I said earlier, state governments, where the Republicans are in charge, implement a policy of making it hard for poor people or coloured people to actually get a vote. There'll be fewer voting machines in electorates in regions where they predominate in the turnout. Therefore, they've got to stand in a queue for up to 2 hours to cast their vote. But the Republicans who do these things, because they don't have, as Dennis pointed out, an independent electoral office, the Republican state officials, elected officials who run elections, will see that there are plenty of voting machines in those neighbourhoods where Republicans turn out in force. Now, with these practices, you can't describe America as a liberal democracy. There's other evidence that leads me to that view, but I just wonder whether in a country where it's getting more common for the minority candidate to win the presidency because of the way the electoral college works. France doesn't have an electoral college, they just have a majority vote and a runoff to determine who becomes president. I just wonder whether you can describe America as a democracy at all these days. Not only because of that, but because of the trend line for the Senate, where we're not far from a situation where 30% of America's population will control 70% of the senators. That reflects the urbanisation, and small states like the Dakotas having the same number of senators as the populous states like New York and California. I mean, these trend lines are very serious. And America, trapped with this 1780s constitution that cannot be changed, is going to look, I think, within a few short years, as less and less a political system that can be described as a democracy at all, let alone a liberal democracy.
This is not just Trump either. I mean, you write in this new book about feeling this curve beginning under George W. Bush.
Yeah. And the experts tell us that it'll be more and more common because of urbanisation, the concentration of the voters in big cities and the distorting effect of the electoral college, which awards votes. It's going to become more common to have an election where the candidate with a minority of the popular vote is elected president. Now, other countries, France, for example, which elects its president, can't have this result. They elect the president. America elects delegates to an electoral college, and it has a distorting effect. Thinking of America as being the most powerful country in the world, but one that can't be described as one where the majority vote elects its government, is a bit of a challenge for us.
What do you think, Dennis?
Yes, I agree. I was tempted to point out that, of course, 30% of Australians control the Senate here, because we give the same number of senators to Tasmania as we do to New South Wales. It doesn't matter in our system because party allegiances are so strong. And, of course, we don't choose our government through the Senate. I would only add to what Bob said, in fact, just to pick up a point Bob has already made, the amount of money that is now involved in running for office in the United States is quite extraordinary. And one of the interesting things about the midterms is that the Democrats, first time for a very long time, have actually got more money than the Republicans. Now, what they're going to do with it, I'm not quite sure. In fact, the Senator Heitkamp in North Dakota was apparently deluged with so much money in the last week that they don't know what to spend it on. Because, North Dakota has a limited TV market. There's a limit to how many commercials you can run on Fargo television late at night. But I think Bob's right. And I think it raises very interesting questions about the rhetoric that our leaders like to use about our shared values with the United States.
Shared values,
right?
Yeah.
Our shared values do not actually mean that we believe, I hope they don't mean, that we believe that somebody should be elected president because he or she has a minority of votes, but the capacity to use social media in all sorts of ways that in effect suppress the other side.
One thing you have to give America credit for, I define America in these terms. America, I think it was our mutual friend Gore Vidal who impressed this on me. He said, we're not a democracy. Don't talk about that. We're not a democracy. We don't pretend to. He said, we're a republic. And there's an insight in that. I think you can describe America safely with all these disturbing trend lines making it resemble less and less a democracy in the way Australasia or Canada or Western or Europe are democracies. You can say America's a republic with constitutionally entrenched freedom of expression. It might not be a democracy, but it does take freedom of expression very seriously. And the document the Founding Fathers drafted, while it's having this distorting, non-democratic effect, is nonetheless continuing to confer this argumentative and increasingly divided republic with the distinction of being a country with very robust, constitutionally entrenched freedom to have your say.
Yes, but, and there's always a yes, but, isn't there, in these discussions? And the yes, but is that, in a sense, Trump's great achievement has happened. He has stacked the Supreme Court with people whose views on freedom of expression may not be exactly the same as the ones those of us on this stage would have.
Or the retiring Supreme Court
exactly.
justices. Yeah.
And it's perfectly, there will be some very interesting cases that will test this. And because Bob referred to the way in which state legislatures operate and control the mechanisms of voting. They also control the mechanisms of distribution. The word gerrymander comes from the very effective American process of distributing electorates in ways that will favour the party in power. Now, there are a number of cases that have worked their way up to the Supreme Court. The way the Supreme Court has already changed in the 2 years that Trump's been there, my hunch is that the Supreme Court will quite happily allow some of the worst gerrymanders to continue. And there are states still, the two Carolinas, I think, certainly North and I think also South, would be very good examples. You bottle up all the black voters in one or two districts, you draw the lines in very strange ways that our electoral commissioners would not allow, and that means the rest of the state effectively is predominantly white and likely to vote Republican.
Again, no electoral commission. But the federal electoral boundaries, the boundaries of these federal electorates, these are drawn by state legislatures. And the Republicans, up till now, have had, I think for 2 decades, easy dominance of the state legislatures. And guess what? In Texas and the Carolinas, they've been drawn to give a built-in advantage to Republicans of, I think it's about 6%, in House of Representatives elections. I think there are so many stresses in the American system. I'd underline Dennis's conclusion a moment ago. It's getting harder for us to cheerfully say shared values. And I think a lot of Australians would say, given that America has gun outrages directed at infant schools and church congregations and synagogue congregations on an average of once every 2 or 3 months, enough talk of shared values. A country that elevates the right of people to own military quality hardware and to take it out on civilian populations doesn't lend us easy rhetoric about shared values any longer.
Do you think the Senate is more important to the Republicans at this point, given its potential to keep shaping the Supreme Court? I mean, I sort of feel like if the world is lucky, then whatever happens with the Supreme Court, if we're lucky, will be Trump's biggest legacy. If you understand my meaning.
That's frightening because it's deadly serious. Think of the Supreme Court. Australians should think of the Supreme Court as a third electoral chamber in the American system. We should stop talking about conservative and liberal judges and just see them for what they are, Democrats and Republicans. This is a politicised constitutional court. There are 2 ailing justices among the 9. They are Stephen Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think she might be approaching 90.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and Breyer in his 80s. They're liberals. In Breyer's case, he might be described as a centrist. It's pretty likely those positions are going to be vacant during Trump's presidency. We will have Kavanaugh-style fights for each of those vacancies. And the chances are that Trump will get away with filling them. And I agree with your mordant pessimism, Sally, that if that's the worst, bad as it is, if that's the worst legacy of Trump we live with, then we can be relieved, because I think the prospect of war involving the officially designated gold-plated enemies that Washington is now every American administration now has to have a 3-nation axis of evil.
Yes.
As Bill Clinton said to me on one of his visits to Australia, he said, you know, there are some people in my country who think America must always have enemies. And George W. Bush nominated 3. They comprised an axis of evil. He then proceeded to invade the first on the list, and unsurprisingly, the other 2, Iran and North Korea, reading textbooks of realist international relations, proceeded to acquire nuclear weapons. It hasn't taken Trump more than 2 years to get 3 official designated enemies. On October the 4th, he had Pence declare a Cold War between the US and China, sensing that there was too much diplomatic contact between America and Iran, inherited from the Obama administration. America is trying to unravel the multinational agreement with Iran that's been successful in deflecting Iran, persuading Iran not to pursue the weaponization of its nuclear capacity. We've got China, we've got Iran, and there was James Clapper on Four Corners, our own Four Corners, declaring solemnly, I see Russia as an existential enemy of the United States. Well, that's an extraordinary statement, that America, with 800 overseas bases, 300,000 troops stationed around the world, the whole globe divided up into American military commands with navies in every one of the world's oceans, that this America, spending more on arms than the next dozen nations combined, with more troops overseas than that of all the other nations in the world combined, faces a threat to its very existence from Putin's Russia. So I wanted to get us onto this subject because it is grim, and we are being asked to trust the instincts of this populist and white nationalist and protectionist, this American firster in the White House, when it comes to the great issue of peace and war. It hasn't taken him long to say there are three nations who we now view, I think gratuitously, as official enemies.
Dennis, what do you fear the most? While we're all...
It's very scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Bob's right,
yeah,
but
it is.
What is most scary is that when George W. Bush named his three, they were tiny, right? They didn't matter. Okay, and of course, interesting, when Trump first came in as president, he would have named North Korea. But we know that he's now fallen in love with the leader of North Korea, and they have been removed.
He talks about it as his love affair.
He does,
Yeah.
yes. No, I use the term falling in love as a direct quotation from the president. But to take on simultaneously China and Russia, which really means to explode all the very careful attempts to create a post-Cold War structure of some sort of, not global governance, we're very far from that, but at least some sort of global interaction is very, very frightening. And it looks as if the current Secretary of Defence, Jim Mattis, will be sacked. This will mean that presumably yet another crazy American firster will come in and be sitting around the table in the White House. It does become very grim.
So meanwhile, in these electoral races, the Democrats, of course, they're not having public conversations like this at all. All they're talking about is healthcare. It's,
Yes.
I mean, I think even I heard something on
Like
a podcast.
Daniel Andrews.
What did you have for breakfast? Healthcare, right? Doesn't matter what they're asked, healthcare.
Yeah.
Is that the right tactic?
Well, Bob, you
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 go,
ran
Dennis.
for office many times. I mean, the reality is, if you're out there trying to win votes in Iowa, you are not going to talk about international relations. Although, in fact, in Iowa, you might well want to talk about the effect of taking on a trade war with China. Because the Chinese, and Bob, you will correct me if I'm right, my understanding is the Chinese have very carefully retaliated to Trump's tariffs by imposing tariffs on goods that will hurt the Trump base. And I think that soybeans, and the soybean industry is big in Iowa, are one of the areas the Chinese have slapped tariffs on. Is that correct?
Yeah. But for the time being, he seems to be holding that base, despite the economic distress those soybean farmers are suffering, which would feed the theory that, again and again, in America especially, you can get voters to take account of a cultural issue over economic self-interest.
Bob, you followed the electoral map very closely at the time of Trump's election. And I remember having a talk with you about a year ago when you said, and I know you still say this, that you think Trump will win again. You barely doubt it, that he'll win a second term. Tell us why you believe that, and what the midterm numbers or sense of things tells you that would support that.
Yeah, part of his political genius is that he's claimed for the Republican Party the big issues of immigration and trade, and they're powerful motivators. And you can see how I noticed, talk about polling, qualitative polling shaping a political message. He went through a phase when he was able to stick to a message, and he kept asserting strong borders, safe communities. strong borders, safe communities. And he was saying that because someone told him our focus group polling shows you link the two. You have strong borders, you have less crime in your suburb. And you saw it in his State of the Union address in January when he had people in the gallery. Talk about vulgar display. He had families that had suffered the loss of a family member because of crime perpetrated by a gang of foreign-born intruders. So he owns that issue. He owns the issue of trade. He can credibly say that he's renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, and he can certainly say he stood up to China. Hence, at those rallies, they wave placards that read, promises made, promises kept. I just think he's hanging on to that electoral college majority that got him over the line. That majority, that white working class male base that got him Wisconsin, to the distress of the Clintons, forcing Hillary to spend so many pages in her memoir explaining that she really did work hard to hold Wisconsin. Don't believe the myth that she didn't go there. She went there several times. So I just think he's holding that base. And I think the other thing that cuts in here is the weakness of the Democrats. I mean, I was a surrogate Democrat. I loved the great pageant of the 20th century Democratic Party. Franklin Roosevelt, I worship him, and his wife Eleanor. I love those people. To this day, my favourite US president. But I gotta say, it's in a poor state. And I can't see among the women senators and the small state governors, Bernie Sanders himself, I can't see the compelling candidate they've got to unite the party and take on Trump.
Dennis, can you see anyone?
It's the second point that really bothers me, because my fear is that the Democrats will tear themselves to pieces. The American presidential election is very complex because the primaries, the almost year-long battle for the nomination, means that the winning candidate has to take on his own party. Now, the interesting thing is that Trump was denounced by pretty well every other Republican candidate. They all said this man is totally unfit to be president. Interestingly, none of it stuck. People like Ted Cruz, if we're very lucky, the senator who may not be re-elected from Texas next week, Ted Cruz.
That alone would make me joyous.
Well, I think, Bob,
Trump's been helping him campaign.
Were Ted Cruz to lose, Sally, I think we all come back with champagne on stage, right? But the point is that somehow Trump survived that, whereas Hillary didn't. Now, quite why that is, I'm not sure. I don't have some grand theory that explains it. My fear is that the same thing will happen in 2020, that if Trump... Now, I think there's a big if. I look at Trump and I think, my God, this man, he's not young. He's not healthy looking. He doesn't seem to sleep because he's out there tweeting at 3 a.m. and getting up to watch Fox Breakfast, which by itself should give someone a stroke. So... you know, there is the possibility that he won't be running again anyway. But if he does, I think that the point that Bob's making about the weakness of the Democrats becomes crucial. Because to beat Trump, you need someone as charismatic, but charismatic in a very different way. You don't need the sort of worthy policy person that Hillary was, nor, I suspect, can you get away with a firebrand. And I'm not quite sure that there is anyone, and this is where I think we're in agreement. I can't, if you said to me, who would you like the Democrats to nominate in 2020, I actually don't have a candidate in mind. I don't know if you do.
No, I don't. And, you know, I got nothing to say in this. If I were governor of a Rocky Mountain state, a Democrat, of course, I don't know what I'd say to this American electorate. What would you say? I mean, my instincts would be to have careful Blair Clinton era policies, affordable promises, trying to win arguments, but all that politics has gone out of the way. I just thought the politics of populism, which is going to be my new study at university from April next year when my 5-year term working on Australia-China relations runs out, has got to accommodate the fact that Jeremy Corbyn can stand up at the British Labour Party conference and promise to nationalise big industries, to tax anyone's second home, and to go on with a list of policies that my generation of social democrats would have run away from. And he doesn't suffer any adverse consequences. I spoke to a bunch of students at Sydney University last night and I said, your generation of voters is changing politics. I said, born after Thatcher, you haven't got an aversion to things that I shifted the Labor Party away from. Nationalisation, more state control, anti-business policies. These are popular now. And so it is in the United States, where Bernie Sanders did not suffer from being described as a socialist. This is bloody extraordinary. So I have got no idea what direction the Democratic Party should go in. I have lost the plot. I would have been a sort of Hillary Clinton supporter without great enthusiasm, but I don't see how you package liberal internationalism and there used to be the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC. Clinton was associated with it, and it was sort of in the mid-90s pulling the Democratic Party away from a sort of pro-union, anti-business agenda. They were sort of the American equivalent of Blairite modernisers. That's where I would have been. But this ain't a vote winner anymore. Bernie Sanders' policies are popular and Jeremy Corbyn's around the world. There's the new politics of populism. But I don't see how that wins against
and of course,
Trump's white nationalism.
Yeah, exactly. Both of them lost. I mean, you're right. And I must say, I'm also puzzled because I feel my generation are too old. And I'm totally astounded at the number of 20-year-olds who see people like Sanders and Corbyn as the hope for the future. But I think the reality is Corbyn and Sanders both lost. So that doesn't give the Democrats an easy solution.
Clinton and Sanders both lost. You said Corbyn and Sanders.
Well, Corbyn lost the general election as well.
He did pretty well.
He did very well.
Close, yeah.
He did very well. But
So did Hillary at that point. He didn't win. Yeah.
But I think the point is that neither the Blairite Clinton model works, nor, I think, does the Sanders-Corbyn model. So we need something, and I don't know what that something is. I mean, my hunch is that the only Democrat who could win is somebody who would appear to people to be authentically working class. Because Trump played on the deep fear and dislike of the elite. Again, one is
That's
amazed.
classic populism.
Exactly.
The people against the elite.
Exactly, and
That's
one
the
is
definition
amazed
of populism.
that a millionaire is so able to use that. But he used it very effectively against Hillary. I think that's the one area where the Democrats might find ways of undercutting his cultural base. But I don't know who the candidate is who could do that.
In mid-2015, Trump announced he was running for president. He did it in the Trump Tower, the gold-plated Volga Palace, and he said the big issue for him was stopping immigration. Rapists and murderers were entering America. With that rhetoric, he shot to the top of the lineup of Republicans seeking their nomination. He got to the top and he stayed there without preferential voting in their primaries. His plurality kept him in the race. If they'd had a runoff election or preferential voting, of course, the others would have more or less ganged up on him and relegated him. So, I mean, that's the genius here. We saw his performance in the debates, the things he was saying about women, about his rivals, about Hispanic voters. We saw him at rallies saying you beat up that protester and he said, I'll pay your legal bills. He offended every law, every rule in the book for pitching to the middle ground, seeking softly committed voters from the other side, and yet he won. A genius without talent, a genius without the normal political talent, but with a genius capacity for building a new politics.
I've read a lot about what the role of affluent, college-educated white women will be in these midterms, which is a different demographic, of course, that got Trump elected. But if the Democrats are to win back the House, particularly, they're going to need these, Romney Republican women to change their mind and vote Democrat.
I think they're the people we in Australia call doctors' wives.
Right, okay.
To which Hillary, if Hillary were here, she would say, with a note of irritation and curdling resentment, why didn't they get out and vote last time?
Yeah.
Are they likely to this time, Dennis?
Look, the polls suggest that there are a number of districts, which is what they call them, where there are a large number of well-educated, reasonably affluent, traditional Republican voters who may well swing. And they tend to be in suburban areas. There are a large number of them in California. I think there are 6 or 7 districts in California currently that are Republican, that are up for grabs. If you look at the maps, and you can all look at the New York Times, which likes giving you a whole lot of graphic illustration of this, you'll see that these districts are clustered around a number of the big cities.
Philadelphia, Chicago.
Yeah. But I had the same response. One of the things we have to remember, we keep talking about the white working class men who voted for Trump. The reality is that a majority of white women voted for Trump. And I think that's very important for us to think about, that for all the things that we knew about Trump, that they knew about Trump, in the end, they didn't care. And I think that is seriously a real challenge for the Me Too movement. If women will forgive Trump, it seems, any crudeness, any excess, any clear example of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, what hope is there?
Oh, cheerful, isn't it? Would you like to ask a question and, add to the cheer? Just start talking if a microphone lands in your hand.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, gentlemen, for very entertaining analysis. And thank you, Bob, for... I've been waiting for one word to be mentioned, and you've mentioned it once tonight, which is the word Hispanic. And you were talking about the gerrymander and about bottling up the black vote, but as I understand it, the fastest growing population group in America are the Hispanics. And given Trump's antagonism towards everything south of the wall, I'm just wondering whether you could give us perhaps some analysis on how you think the Hispanic vote might have an effect in the upcoming elections. Thank you.
We've got to pick through this very carefully. 10 years ago, analysts would have said we're headed for the Democratic Party as being the permanent majority party because we're becoming a majority-minority nation. In other words, America was ceasing to be a white nation. It's not quite working out like that. The Hispanics did not get out and vote in the numbers, or for that matter, African Americans, that would have hurt Trump in the last election. There is, in Republican circles, the hope that, for want of a better descriptor, family values, religious observance in Hispanic communities is going to keep them in reasonable numbers open to Republican Party persuasion. And I think this election will tell us, will answer the question, how are the Hispanics trending? Can it be assumed that when Hispanics turn out, that they will turn out and vote, in serious numbers, and two, whether they are lining up against the new Trump-era Republican Party at all. I think we're almost at the point where we can revise the notion that America's becoming a majority-minority nation, a brown nation, and where the Democrats are going to be permanently advantaged. It ain't quite working out like that, certainly at this stage.
Well, I think the polls suggest that about 30% of Hispanic voters are still Republican. If that could be moved by 10%, and if the enrolments and turnout could be increased by 10%, that would be enough to swing a few crucial states. And I think that we already made reference to Senator Ted Cruz in Texas. There is a very strong Democratic candidate running in Texas. I think it's unlikely he'll win, but Texas and Florida are the two states that if the Hispanic vote and turnout were to move by that 10% to the Democrats, that then changes. I think you'd agree, Bob, that would change the electoral geography for 2020. Because if a Democrat could win Texas and Florida, along with the other states that you would expect a Democrat to win, that candidate would win the White House.
Great.
A couple of very brief comments for your response. On an international level, I've really felt that this midterm is so important for the world because I want America to once again to be seen as having, even though it's an incredibly flawed system, but having a system that can respond to this horror of Trump. And I think that people around the world would breathe a little easier if they saw the American people respond to their terrible mistake of not coming out in great numbers to vote. So that's one thing. The other thing about the governors,
We'll need a question, please.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I just
Okay.
wanted their response
Okay.
about that.
Yeah.
I don't need to go into the governors thing. It's about Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker are just a couple of possibilities.
Thank you.
I don't think they offer hope of beating Trump. Trump against Elizabeth Warren looks like a rerun of Trump versus Hillary. She's interesting because she struck an anti-big business position. She's got legislation in the Congress that would, this is remarkable, that would install employee representatives on the boards of US companies, something like the continental European system of worker representation. That's a revolutionary proposition and a legal obligation. It'd never get through Congress. Big money would destroy it. But it's her legislation, it's in Congress, and a proposition that under the law, company boards have to take account of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. This shows how socialistic notions are creeping up under the pressure of left-wing populism, even in the American political system. But I don't see her as capable of clawing back white, aggrieved, working-class males in those 4 industrial states. It'd be too much of a rerun of 2016, I fear. And whether Cory Booker... One thing that strikes me about America, with all its great freedom of expression and its insistence in judge-made law and statute law on the equality of races, great American achievement, the triumph of civil rights, the triumph of women's rights and LGBT rights through its legal system. Despite all of that, I think it's impossible to overlook racial prejudice. Ironically, after the Obama presidency, I think resentment of African Americans continues in many white electorates to be a voting force, even stronger than it was before Obama.
Can I just make a response, and it's a pessimistic response, to your hope that people around the world would be cheered by a democratic victory? And my response is, look at what has just happened in Brazil. What is happening in the United States is not unique. It is happening in many countries around the world. We can sit here in the Wheeler Centre, where I suspect most of the people in this room share the views of those of us on the stage about President Trump. But we shouldn't assume that those are necessarily the views held globally. And Trump, obviously, I think that the most scary thing about Trump is that he has given permission to the worst aspects of populism, and that permission is being grabbed. And you can look around, though, you can find examples literally on every continent. And the most recent and the most tragic, I think, or I feel personally, is what has just happened in Brazil with the election of someone who actually makes Donald Trump look in some ways like a softie.
Yeah, it's the end of the notion of American exceptionalism. Historians used to hold the view that America was so sui generis, it was outside the normal laws for development. Other advanced industrial countries had national health care, banned assault rifles, didn't enshrine them in their constitution and their laws and practice. There was a conservative party up against a trade union or working class-based social democratic party. America was different and America was special. But now in this era of populism, America is just the same as Hungary or Italy. Trump has been produced by anti-immigrant sentiment, the way anti-immigrant sentiment has produced the Alternative for Deutschland in the Federal Republic of Germany, or the National Front in France, or a government in Italy that's a coalition of two populist forces with the traditional political parties banished completely. Trump's not exceptional. I know this is pulling the argument away from the question, but it's a point I wanted to get up. Trump, the rise of populism, the capture of the White House by this fire-breathing populist, shows that America is subject to the same concerns about trade and above all about immigration that has produced a populist rewriting of the rules of politics right through Western Europe and in Brazil and in the Philippines.
2 years ago, the polls were wrong. Has anything been changed? Has there been any analysis on why that happened and any changes to methodology on the polling to give us more confidence in this time, polling around?
Well, I suppose the pollsters would say that they weren't that wrong. They were right in the sense that Hillary did poll 3 million votes more than Trump. They clearly were wrong in calling a couple of crucial states. And the pollsters just didn't see what was coming on. I don't think that the polls we have for midterms are very meaningful, because you have polls in each state and in each district. And I doubt that any of them are particularly reliable. I know that a huge amount of work has gone on to try and refine polling. My hunch is it's getting more difficult. And I say this as someone who in the last week has probably had 5 unsolicited phone calls for the forthcoming Victorian state election, which always begin, this will only take a minute of your time. And by the time we get to the 3rd minute, I hang up. And I suspect that is the reaction of most people. Polling has, I think, become much more complex in the contemporary world just because of the way in which we use electronic communication. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right, but it's not something I've followed.
We're going to have to wind it up in a minute. Bob and then Dennis, what do you... let me put it another way. I asked Stephen Smith a couple of weeks ago what he thought of the times we live in. And he responded that they're the most, in his lifetime, this is the most dangerous and disruptive time that he has known for the world. How do you feel about where we're tracking?
Well, the changes that stand out for me is America as leader of what might be described as some system of global order. There's a big debate about global order and what it comprises, different definitions of it. But that's the world we grew up in, and it was very comforting for us Australians, because we were part of the US alliance system. We're very happy to be part of the British Empire for that 150 years. We didn't leave the British Empire, no declaration of independence for us. We were happy to have stayed in it. John Curtin gave more speeches during the Second World War saying we were part of the British Empire than he did talking about our links with the US. But we got the US alliance system, and it was very comforting to this predominantly white nation so far away from the centres of world power at the bottom of Asia. But now that system is showing its wear and tear. America is aged, America is deeply divided, and America has got a president who says, I'm in favour of America first, a white nationalist populist. Now, this is frightening and challenging for us. There are some people who say the old order is finished. And this is why Stephen Smith shared those sentiments with you. For people very attached to the American-led order, these are frightening times. The debate we've had in Australia about China is largely because we can't have a debate. It's too frightening for us Australians to have a debate about whether America is always going to be available as our ally and protector. It's easier to lapse into a debate, to drift into a debate where the right-wingers, the pro-alliance people, beat up on China. This is one reason people are uncomfortable. The second reason is the force of populism. With every election that comes through, the political party alignment that we grew up is getting banished. 2 state elections in Germany, and my old party, the Social Democrats, the German Labour Party. In Munich, in Bavaria, down to 10%. In Hesse, down to 20%, just vanishing from sight. What's the Growth Party in Germany? Unbelievably, it is a right-wing nationalist party with elements in it who use Third Reich-style rhetoric with a racist agenda. And the Greens, they're the 2 growth parties. You add the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats together, they haven't got a majority of the German vote. Now, this is happening across jurisdictions. Australia's protected from it because, to put it bluntly, we've controlled immigration. We've controlled irregular migrant flows, something a lot of people here might not be comfortable with, but that's contained the growth of populist forces. They're the 2 big things, I think, that are at work in changing our world, Sally. The US looking shop-worn and distrait, agitated, its pathologies taking over. It'll never go back to normal after the 2-term presidency of Trump. And I think the force of populism, a response to high levels of immigration, in Europe especially, just rewriting our rules and politics in a way, rewriting the party political structure in a way that hasn't happened since the early 20th century.
I think I just want to say that we're probably entering into, in a way, a 3rd stage since the end of World War II. And the first stage was the Cold War. And we all on this platform grew up in the Cold War, where in a way it was quite simple. And that's where the American alliance, in a sense, totally demarcated where we sat. Then I think there was a short period when we believed in a triumphalist rhetoric. The triumphalism was that liberal democracy would expand. It was the wave of the future. In Francis Fukuyama's terms, it was the end of history. I think we've now moved into a period where none of that is predictable. Liberal democracy is not triumphing. And if we look just in our region, we shouldn't forget about Europe, but look at what has happened in Thailand, in the Philippines, possibly will happen in Indonesia. The idea that our sort of world is going to constantly expand is no longer, I think, a viable assumption. And that is scary. But it's also worth remembering that for many people in many parts of the world, life is actually getting better, and that the rebalance of resources between the first world and the rest of the world is actually, in global terms, very positive.
Yeah, the economic centre of the world is shifting towards China and India. So it's probably located now
The economists have worked it out. It's somewhere,
Yeah.
it's somewhere in eastern Russia, yes.
Yeah, that's very positive. The worrying thing is our inability to trust the cool-headedness and good judgment of an American president. Looking back, Reagan took actions that deflected what was a very tense situation between the nuclear powers in 1983. Russians, East Germans misunderstanding NATO war games as being moves for a preemptive war. Reagan, cool-headed, a man of peace, cancelled those NATO military exercises. Can any of us in this room say we'd have confidence? And you look at Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy, working to get backdoor negotiations with Khrushchev to pull us away from the Cuban Missile Crisis and what it portended. Is there a person in this room who could say, hand on heart, they've got confidence in Trump with the demonic presence of a John Bolton over his shoulder to exercise similar good judgment in a tense situation with China over Taiwan Strait, or with Iran, or, if things went bad with his romance, over North Korea?
All right, everyone, enjoy Cup Day on Tuesday. And then you can wake up on Wednesday morning and turn your tellies on and see how all this is panning out, at least for next week. It's been really a clobbering tonight, I have to say. But
listen, you will like my book. It's a
and
different political memoir.
I was just
and
about to say.
There's a lot of humour in it, and a lot of good humour.
That is, and
I just want to hand over a big cheque to Australians for UNHCR, because they're getting all the author proceeds, and it's going to the kids of the Syrian civil war. So please consider, even if you haven't bought another book, Dennis hasn't got one out currently, please consider buying one of the Carr volumes.
They are autographed already. Bob has to leave straight away to go to the airport. He flew down just for this event. He got here at 4 o'clock and he's getting back on a plane in a minute. So we're especially grateful. You're a great friend of this series, and we really appreciate you coming and lending your wonderful experience and expertise, and Dennis Altman as well, same goes for you. Thank you both, and thank you all for coming along.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.